To get started on the job, the first thing that we want to do is make sure that our radiator is nice and cool to the touch. We didn't just come back from a nice road test and it's not hot. After that, go ahead and press this down, turn it counterclockwise to unlock it, and lift it up and away from your face. Give it a quick inspection, set it aside. Now that the radiator cap's off of there, let's make our way underneath the front of the vehicle. We're going to go ahead and remove this plastic shield. Looking at the plastic shield, you're going to find a whole bunch of plastic push clips. To remove these clips, all you have to do is use a trim tool or even just use some cutters and carefully grab onto the center without actually breaking the plastic, and then just pull that down. Once it's unlocked, it should slide right out. There's going to be several that come along inside this area, and you're also going to notice that you have two inside of each of the wheel wells along this area, and then another one right here. Remove your shield. Now that we have that out of the way, we have a nice clear view of the bottom of the radiator. Over on the driver's side, you're going to find the petcock, which is considered the drain for the radiator. Now when I remove this, coolant's going to come out of it. I want to make sure I don't have anything underneath it that might get in the way and divert that coolant so it makes a mess. What we need to happen is this needs to be out of the way. We're going to try to divert this coolant directly into a receptacle so we can recycle it properly. Now with that said, you're going to try to find the mounting points for this wiring harness. There's one located right here. So I'm just going to use a pick. You can use a small screwdriver or whatever you might happen to have. Carefully get in between this area up along here and break it free. Once that's open, you can grab onto that wiring harness. We'll give it a little tug and just try to pull it aside so it's free and clear of this area. Now what you can see that I did here is I used a small piece of cardboard, and I just essentially made a little funneling area to divert everything away from this area so it doesn't make a mess everywhere. Now we can go ahead and open this up, keeping in mind that coolant will come out of it. You need to have hand and eye protection at all times and a collection receptacle under this area. Let's go ahead and carefully grab onto this. We're going to turn it counterclockwise and we should start seeing some coolant come out. Now at this point, you can tell that I've drained out the majority of the coolant. It still has a little bit of a drip, but I'm not necessarily so worried about that. Let's just go ahead and close this off and we'll snug it up. Let's get our wiring resituated. Lock it in so it's secure. Now the next thing that we're going to want to do is come right over here to the Serpentine Belt. What I want to do is just grab onto it and I'm going to give it a little tug. What we're paying attention to is this area right down here, which is considered your Serpentine Belt tensioner. We want to make sure it's functioning properly. If it feels like it doesn't want to move, you're going to have to replace that as well. Before we go ahead and start taking this off, let's pay attention to the routing. You want to make sure you know exactly which pulley it goes over and under. Let's make our way over to this area right here. I'm going to use my Serpentine Belt tool. We'll come right on here. You can also use a wrench if you had to. We're just going to go ahead and turn this counterclockwise. That's going to relieve the tension from the belt. Now we can carefully slide it off of the alternator up here. We'll get our tool out of the way. And we can carefully remove the belt. Once you have it out of the area, you want to give it a quick inspection. This area here is the ribbed area. You want to make sure you don't see a whole bunch of dry rot cracks on it. Aside from that, if you were to turn it over, you have the backing. For this, you want to make sure it doesn't look like it's damaged or extremely shiny. A little bit shiny is okay, but if it's extremely shiny, more than likely you're going to have some sort of a squeal. Overall, this belt looks reusable. I'm going to set it aside. The next thing that we're going to want to do is make our way to removing this pulley from the water pump. To do that, we're going to have to remove all 4 of these 8mm headed bolts. What you're going to notice when you try to turn these counterclockwise to remove them is that this is going to want to spin on you. All I do in that case is just go ahead and put a pry bar or a screwdriver, whatever you might happen to have, in between this area, and just try to put it between one of the bolts and that bulge that you can see in the center. That should essentially hold it for us, and we can continue with our 8mm. Once they're all loose, you can go ahead and remove them. Inspect the bolts as you remove them and set them aside. At this point, I'm going to hold that pulley on the water pump so it doesn't fall off, potentially get damaged by hitting the ground. Now you want to remove the pulley and give it a good inspection. You want to make sure you don't see a whole bunch of pitting or damage on this. A little bit, as you can see on this, isn't too bad. Generally, if you had something, you could go ahead and sand it down a little bit. Just essentially make sure it's a smooth surface. At this point, we're going to get ready to start removing the water pump from the engine. Of course, you're going to want to make sure you have a collection receptacle underneath this area in case there is any coolant. But aside from that, we want to have a look at the brand new water pump. The reason why I want to have a look at it is because you can see on the new water pump where all of the mounting bolt holes are. It's a little bit harder to see on the one that's in the vehicle, especially the lower bolts, so I wanted to give you a clear view. Let's start off by removing our 13mm headed bolts. So if you were to look at these, you can see that you have a whole bunch of smaller looking bolts. These are 3/8 size. But then if you look down along each of the sides of the water pump, you're going to find larger headed bolts. Those are 13mm or even a 1/2 inch socket. Let's go ahead and start removing those carefully. Now keep in mind there could still potentially be a little bit of coolant behind this area. Pull this out. Now, anytime you remove any of these bolts, if you happen to see that it had coolant on the threading, that essentially tells you that it goes into the coolant jacket and you're going to need to use some sort of thread sealer on the threads of the bolts when you go to reinstall them. We've got another larger one right over here. Now I'll make my way over to the other side using the same socket. Now let's switch to our 3/8 socket. We're going to start removing all of the smaller bolts. Before I remove the top ones, I'm going to remove the lower bolt first. There's one. Now we'll do the top 3 up here. I'm just going to take one of my mounting bolts that I went ahead and removed and just put it in here a few good threads. Now we can go ahead and continue with a pry bar and a hammer, and we're going to go ahead and break this free. Go ahead and fully remove that last bolt there. Remove the water pump. There it is, friends. With the water pump out of there, it's going to be time to go ahead and clean up the engine where it mounts to. The areas that you specifically want to clean are the areas where the gasket was. So looking at this, you can see that it goes all the way around this entire area. And then of course right here it is actually flaked up. but we're going to remove the whole thing. So I'm just going to go ahead and get under here with a scraper, being careful not to damage the engine in any way. We'll just see if we can get this to flake up. Continue on by removing the entire gasket. Now at this point I have it scraped down with my scraper. I'm just going to go ahead and wipe it down so I can get a closer look at every area. Once I'm sure that it looks like all the big parts of the gasket are off of there, I'm just going to go ahead and scuff it down with some fine sandpaper right here. Once again, this is just along the gasket area. We don't need to do the entire engine. You want to make sure you get along these pins as well. Try to get off any of the debris that's on those. That'll help you get the water pump on in the end. Keep in mind the gasket does come up into this area right here. Now that I have it sanded, I'm just going to give it one last wipe and of course a close inspection. We need to make sure there's none of that original gasket on there. Okay, at this point that looks amazing. Let's continue on by cleaning up the threading on all of our mounting bolts. Now once you have your bolts cleaned up, let's continue on to putting on our gasket. Now looking at the gasket, you can tell that it has a specific shape. You want to make sure that it lines up perfectly with the engine. Also, when you're lining it up, you have those little pitons that come out of the engine. They're going to want to line up with their specific holes. Let's go ahead and take this, we'll put it on the engine, and then we can grab the water pump with our bolts. All right, I went ahead and I coated the bolt threads with some of that sealer. We also have the water pump. If you were to look at this, you can see that it has this ridge right along here, but it doesn't on the other side. The side with the ridge is the bottom of the water pump. So we're going to go ahead and put this into position on the engine. We'll start in all of our mounting bolts, snug them up, and then we'll torque each of them to manufacturer's specification. Just want to wiggle it around till it slides onto those mounting studs. That's how you know it's perfectly aligned. Now at this point you can start with any of your bolts. We're only going to be starting these in, and we're not going to bottom any of them out until they're all started. With them all started in, we can bottom them out. Let's switch to that 13mm socket. With all the bolts bottomed out, now we can continue on by torquing them. When we torque these, we're going to start with the smaller bolts, and we'll torque those to 16 foot-pounds. Now we can torque our larger bolts to 25 foot-pounds. If you have access to compressed air, go ahead and clean down the area of any of the gasket debris. Let's make sure we get down around that crankshaft. Now it's going to be time to put on the water pump pulley with the bolts. Before we go ahead and put this on, I wanted to show you the back side. Looking at it, you can feel that there's going to be a couple little dimples that come out of it. You want to make sure that those dimples fit into the water pump. Now let's go ahead and put this down and into position. While we're doing this, we're going to try to line up our bolt holes. There we are. It should pretty much want to sit flush. If it sits like it's off kilter, more than likely you don't have those little studs lined up with the holes on the water pump. Start in all of your mounting bolts before you tighten any of them up. With all the bolts started, let's go ahead and hold the pulley still, and we can snug these up. Once you have them all bottomed out, go ahead and torque each of them to 116 inch-pounds. Once it's torqued down, let's continue on by paying attention to this area in between the water pump and the pulley itself. I'm going to spin this, and you want to make sure that the space in between here doesn't get larger and then smaller. If it does, this is sitting off kilter and you need to resituate it. This looks perfect. Now it's time to install the Serpentine Belt. To do this, we're going to take the first loop of it and bring it down and around the crank. That's the main pulley all the way at the bottom. Once it feels as though it's on that, we're going to bring the forward aspect down and around that AC compressor. And then this is just going to make its way up here, so we're going to hold it in this position. Now let's start with the rest of the back of the side of the belt here. Yep. Make sure we're around the crank, inside the grooves. We're going to come up and around this water pump. After we come up and around the water pump, we're going to come up and over the tensioner as well. And then we're going to bring this down and all the way to that power steering pump. That's all the way down at the bottom there. Now at this point, we're going to go ahead and put our tool onto the tensioner, decrease the amount of tension on this so we can slide it over the alternator. Okay. Now you can't stop here. You have to double check all of the pulleys. All the pulleys that are supposed to have the grooves on them that you can see, you need to make sure the belt's sitting directly inside of them. If the belt's sitting off kilter to one side or the other, you're going to completely ruin the belt. Check all of the pulleys. Let's make our way back underneath the driver's side of the vehicle. We'll just make sure that the petcock's closed and tight. Then we can start putting up our splash shield. For this, you want to make sure it goes up and over the ears that are underneath the bumper cover. After that, go ahead and put in all of your push clips. Okay, now it's time to fill our cooling system. Typically, it's a good idea to use some sort of a funnel if you don't have a specialty tool to be able to fill the cooling system. Now, when you fill this, you need to use the manufacturer's specified fluid. You don't want to use green coolant. If you were to look at the overflow tank, you can see that it tells you to use a specific type. Dex Cool. It's kind of like a pink red. If you don't have access to that, you can also use a universal fluid. You just want to make sure that it's 50-50 mixed, so it's not complete concentrate. So all I'm going to do is just take some coolant. We'll pour it right in here. This is the universal coolant, so that's why it's this color. It's not green. It's actually yellow. We'll just go ahead and fill up the cooling system. Once it's full, we can go ahead and start it up and burp out any air in the system. Now the next thing that we want to do is go ahead and start up the vehicle. We're going to let it run for a while. What we need to happen is the cooling fans, they need to be able to turn on. Once those turn on, that's going to tell us that the thermostat's open, and we should have some hot heat blowing out the vents. At that point, there shouldn't be any more air inside the system, and we can go ahead and turn off the car, and then of course we can remove the coolant funnel. Once you're sure it's full and there's no air in the system, let's go ahead and reinstall the radiator cap and make sure it's nice and tight. Once the radiator's full, let's make our way over to the coolant overflow. You want to pay attention to the side along here. Essentially, you want to make sure it's up to the full cold line. That's that bottom line right there, and definitely not too much higher than the full hot line. Just get it anywhere in between. Cap it off when you're done. Okay friends, we got the car back together. What's left to do now? Now typically you're going to want to go ahead and start up the vehicle again and let it run for a little while. We're just wanting to make sure that the coolant's nice and full. You have plenty of heat coming from those vents. After that, go ahead and take it for a road test. Make sure you don't hear any funny noises and you don't have a check engine light. Thanks for watching.